But let's get back to ALEC, because I think this is an important issue that we need to delve a little bit deeper into, because it's not only Republicans that are part of ALEC. There are Democrats as well. And joining me to talk about the efforts of the Progressive Change Campaign Committee, which you can find at boldprogressives.org. I'm joined by State Senator Eric Griego. He's a candidate for Congress in New Mexico, and he's one of the leaders behind this Dump ALEC campaign. Senator, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Karl. Thanks for having me.
You know, I always find it funny when state senators run for Congress, because they're basically running so they can be called representative, and then maybe one day they can get to be called senator again.
Well, I've been called much worse, that's for sure. So
I'm sure. I have today as well.
I want to make sure, Karl, I am not a member of ALEC. I just want to make sure that's
that's
clear.
My point, right? I mean, there are Democrats in ALEC for some godforsaken reason.
Yeah, well, in our case, we have a kind of a coalition in the Senate of a few Democrats who vote with Republicans, and it is not uncommon on the floor of the Senate to have ALEC dinners announced and ALEC's research announced, and the extolling of the virtues of ALEC. I've never heard a similar speech, at least not from any of our conservative leadership around the Progressive Change Campaign Committee or Progressive States Network, the groups that are trying to, in a much more modest way, promote an alternative to this, this pretty well organized in sort of insiders game that ALEC is promoting in legislatures across the country, and they're very effective. When it's one thing to have, I was reading the list of my colleagues on the website, on ALEC's website, who were part of it. But it's one thing to have most of my Republican colleagues on there, although even some of them are put off and are a little afraid to even be on ALEC's website. But to see that we have some Democrats who are participating, whether they're official members or just going to the dinners and the schmoozing, I was very, very disappointed. Unfortunately, two of them of my colleagues in the Senate, neither of whom I actually knew were members, have distanced themselves in the last few days from ALEC, and I think that's thanks to the work of the Progressive Change Campaign Committee, of a lot of other folks who are really starting to hold Democrats accountable. And I think that's what this election is about, from the president on down to every state house across the country, is, if we're really going to have people who say, Democrats in particular, who say they fight for people, for working families, for health care for people, for investing in each other, as opposed to just taking care of the most well-heeled and most powerful corporations.
Senator, why would you want to do any of that great stuff when you can weaken environmental controls so that you can give more children asthma and make money while doing it?
Well, as the father of a kid with asthma, not bad asthma, but it's so common.
If you let ALEC have their way, we can make it really bad asthma.
Well, the beauty of it is that Big Pharma is also one of ALEC's big supporters, and they, I'm sure, are eager to develop...
Senator, that's what we call the circle of life when it comes to special interests. You pollute my air, I'll give you an inhaler.
Exactly. It's increasing market share. So let me just tell you, we have over 800 lobbyists in Santa Fe, in the state capitol, and the overwhelming majority are corporate lobbyists. So if that wasn't enough for the guys to be representing all of the big, and they're mostly the big corporate interests. Every pharmaceutical company has a lobbyist. Every big oil and gas company has a lobbyist. But in addition to that, we have these co-chairs in the House and the Senate of ALEC members who have a dinner annually, who fly people out to conferences.
But that's not lobbying, is it, Senator?
Oh no, of course not, because it actually doesn't happen in the lobby. It happens at the swanky restaurant down the street called the Bull Ring.
But that's where the lobbying happens, anyways. I mean, so my question is, one of the things that I was talking to Ari Melber from The Nation about ALEC today, and it occurred to me as I've been thinking about ALEC these last few months, and obviously more so since the Trayvon Martin case came to light. I have friends that that I've known for years through politics that in the last few years have decided to make a run for office themselves, and some have even gotten elected to state legislatures in places like Vermont and Maryland. And my friend in Vermont is a good example. She's a freshman state house member in a volunteer legislature where I think she makes a couple $100 a year. It's not full time. She doesn't have a full-time staff to help with her legislative duties. And they might even share a legislative staff between multiple members. And by staff, I mean one or two people. Don't you think that type of setup makes people more susceptible to groups like ALEC and lobbyists?
Well, we're set up exactly the same way. We get no salary. We would get some per diem while we're in session. And
I'm not saying you should be lavished with money. I'm just saying that you should be at least put in a position that you can shut the door on those people if you want to.
But it's not just the money, it's the staff. I mean, we have a great legislative staff, but at the end of the day, often whenever I've sponsored lobbyist sort of regulatory legislation, what some of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle say, we need their help, we need their input, we need their help, and as opposed to it happening in restaurants, it really does happen in citizen legislatures like New Mexico. The lobbying happens from advocates outside the floor of the Senate. We're very accessible, but those are people who have to stand in line to argue for, continuing Medicaid funding or to make sure we don't defund drug courts, as some of my colleagues have asked for. But the real work where you get 2 or 3 or 4 hours of a legislator's time happen at the swanky dinners, where ALEC hosts folks and brings in these big national Republican speakers, and they fly you out to conferences.
Well, Senator, I want you to stick around because I want to talk a little bit more about this, because if you come to Washington as a congressman next fall, you won't be able to go to those swanky dinners. You'll have to stand up and eat the food, because that's real reform, and that's what we have in Washington. No more swanky dinners at restaurants. You have to stand at receptions. So this is the Thom Hartmann program. Please stick around. We're talking about ALEC, and we're doing so with a great state senator from the state of New Mexico.
This is the Thom Hartmann program.
Up more on those Democrats that are part of ALEC. Welcome back. This is the Thom Hartmann program, filling in for Tom all afternoon. Karl Frisch, it's 20 after the top of the hour. We're talking to Senator Eric Griego from New Mexico about ALEC and all these Democrats that have been involved there, and what ALEC does and how we can kind of strike back and get the tide turning in the other direction. He also happens to be a candidate for Congress in New Mexico. Senator, thanks for sticking around.
Great to be here.
So tell me about your campaign. How is the ALEC dynamic impacting what you're seeing on the campaign trail?
Well, I think people really want to have a choice. I have a contested primary, and I'm running against two much more centrist sort of corporate Democrats, and I have been able to really talk about the work that me and the other progressive members of the state Senate have done, and to really distinguish for people in primary. I mean, everybody thinks it's this Republican-Democratic, dichotomy, and in fact, it's not enough to have a D behind your name in a primary. People really need to know what you stood up for. So for me, it's been a good opportunity to talk about, all of the legislation that I've been fighting for since I was, I used to be a city councilman, whether it was minimum wage, which of course all of the ALEC local supporters in the chambers opposed, or whether it's asking out-of-state corporations to pay the same taxes as in-state. New Mexico is one of the few states left where you can actually declare your profits in another state, and that really hurts our revenues at the state level.
Sure.
And we've been talking about this for years, and at the end of the day, it's been some of my conservative Democratic colleagues who've been the deciding votes to
and
not be able to.
That ends up being a problem pretty often. I mean, even here in Washington, it's something you'll probably encounter if you make it to Congress. I mean, what ends up happening is you may have some liberal Republicans in Congress, but they always vote in lockstep with the Republicans. The problem with the more conservative Democrats, and I frankly, there are districts where if a Democrat's going to represent it's going to be a conservative. But the problem with them, frankly, is that, when push comes to shove, they go with the Republicans on a lot of these issues. They don't stand toe-to-toe with Democrats. So there really isn't this balance. We're much more diverse as a party, and much less lockstep than the Republicans are. How liberal, conservative is your district?
It's about a 55% Democratic district. So our current congressman was very much came out of the environmental community, very progressive guy, and now he's running for the U.S. Senate. And
that's Martin Heinrich.
Heinrich, yeah. And so it's this isn't Berkeley, or this isn't certainly
sure.
But I don't think the things we're talking about are necessarily quote unquote progressive issues.
No, they're
Democratic and they're American issues.
Right.
making corporations accountable and pay their fair share, and not letting them get away with not paying taxes in New Mexico, or
right.
The minimum wage, or
Senator, they are people too, except when asked to do what people do.
Exactly. So that's my point. Is the great way to marginalize a lot of the issues that I've been working on as a state senator and hope to work on in Congress is to say, oh well, if you don't hold corporations accountable, and if you don't give them for example, if you don't give them this tax cut or that tax incentive, the famous moniker in our legislature is you're anti-business, which means if you won't be an absolute lapdog for ALEC and all those guys, you're anti-business. And what a lot of us Democrats are trying to say is, look, we're all for jobs. We just want to make sure we're not giving away the store, and that we're also investing in schools and early childhood and healthcare, the things that build a strong economy, not just tax incentives for the biggest corporations. And most of them are out of state. It'd be one thing if there were a lot of New Mexico small businesses, and I'm sure my colleagues across the country face the same challenge.
We actually, we have a call from Russ in Nampa, Idaho, who's got a comment about the Idaho state legislature. Maybe you have something to say about that. Russ, welcome to the show.
Hi there, Karl. Idaho's legislature is part-time also. They run from January until the end of March, sometimes a few weeks longer if they can't get their legislation suited up. But the legislation that you can expect from the Idaho legislature next year will be what's on the agenda for the larger Republican agendas from like Florida or from like Ohio or from like Virginia or Oklahoma, because they're not allowed any type of budget for staff or any pay. They get maybe about $1,500 for their participation in legislature.
Russ, you end up with legislators then that can afford to serve, because you really can't maintain a real job outside of that unless you have like a professional occupation where you can just take off 6 months at a time, right? What do you think about that, Senator?
Well, in our legislature, we only meet for once a year for 30 days in budget years, and then in the other years we meet for 60 days, so it's even shorter. We get paid per diem while we're up there, but you're absolutely right. The folks who tend to be able to do this are either independently wealthy, have strong corporate ties, use it as a business development opportunity, or for a few of us, we have teachers. I ran a nonprofit. You have a few people who, either have to work out a way that they don't go broke doing it, or many of them just have to kind of make do. So I commute to Santa Fe. It's an hour away. It's not a big deal. But, for colleagues who are from 2 and 3 hours away, the per diem's never going to cover it. So that they actually lose money being on the legislature. And there aren't a lot of people who can afford to do that.
Especially and get the experience so that they know what it's like to be a legislator, after a few terms. I mean, I feel like and you don't have to agree with me, but in my opinion, term limits, these volunteer legislatures, these part-time legislatures, it's the wrong medicine for a real problem, which is entrenched incumbents who don't do the work of the people. But that's just my opinion. Senator, I want to thank you for joining me and talking with me about ALEC.
Absolutely, and thanks a lot, Karl. And my website's griegoforcongress.com if you want to help. I really appreciate it.
And that's GRIEGO for Congress.com. Senator, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Karl.